Hello and welcome to the Christ Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. This is Matthew Best. I serve as pastor of Christ Lutheran Church in Allison Hill in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thanks for being here. If today's message connects with you and what you're going through, brings you inspiration, or offers connection with God, I ask you to please stay on after the message for just a few moments to learn ways to connect with the congregation and the health ministries that we offer. And now, let's dive into God's Word. A reading from Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into the furnace of burning fire." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and that you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace to be heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. But the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men, and the hair on their heads was not singed. Their tunics were not harmed, and not even a smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. It's an old fable story. Hans Christian Andersen is the one who wrote it. I didn't realize that. I was familiar with the story and doing a little bit of research. I found out he's the one who wrote it. It's part of this book of fables. It was published in 1837. So it goes back a bit far. A bit surprised by all that. So it's a really simple. As far as the story goes, you have this vain emperor, this egotistical, narcissistic emperor, and everybody knows that he's like this. And so there's a couple of con men who come to town, and they go, "Oh, king, we have some of the most fine clothing ever made. It's so light you won't even feel like you're wearing anything. And only people who are stupid or foolish or don't deserve to be in their position, those people won't even be able to see the clothing. Let me show you an example." And they pull out, just like I'm doing literally right now. Do you see this fine clothing? Well, Anna, it brings into question some things. If you can't see, and only the people who are foolish can't see it. Oh, there you go. Good job. So the king is, of course, there's nothing there, right? There's nothing there. But the king, of course, doesn't, now that he's been set up by these con men, he doesn't want to be like, well, there's nothing here. So he's like, oh, yes, that's very fine. Guess what all the people around him do? Oh, that's just amazing, because they don't want to look foolish and they don't want to look like they don't deserve their position. So he hires them to make this fine outfit. And they say, "King, when this is done," and they work on this for weeks. It's amazing. They're working night and day, and they're working hard at nothing. You ought to have a parade. You ought to show off this amazing outfit. The king doesn't want to look foolish. All his advisors, that's a great idea, because they don't want to look foolish. So they set up a parade. And here comes the king, out in his finest new outfit that only someone who is foolish and doesn't deserve the position they're in cannot see. And they go through the town. And everyone, "Oh, yes, that's amazing, Emperor. That's the finest outfit." Everyone, from his advisors to the townspeople, all are in on this, and they're all saying it even though they see that there's nothing there. And it's a little boy who says out loud, "But he's not wearing anything," because he's the only one that's willing to tell the truth. And it's at that point the king has to make a decision. Do we stop with this foolishness, or do we continue? And the story, the way that Hans Christian Andersen finishes it, is the parade continued because the king didn't want to look foolish. And yet he continues doing the very thing that he didn't want to look foolish. And all of these people were foolish. And the con men were off somewhere else doing their next con job. I'm reminded of that story when I read through today's reading in Daniel. This reading, in case you didn't pick it up, is full of humor and mockery and over-the-top ridiculousness. How many times did Jim have to read how many instruments and how many different officials? Every single time. It's over the top. It's that way on purpose. It was written that way to be on purpose. Remember the context real quick. This was written when Israel was under oppression from the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus Epiphanes had desecrated the temple. Nebuchadnezzar is Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a malignant narcissist, which is what Nebuchadnezzar shows up in this. It's all over the place, right? Nebuchadnezzar, remember last week? Do you remember the stories? He has this dream, and he's like, send in the folks to interpret the dream, but I'm not telling you what it is. I'm sorry, but nobody in their right mind does that. And Daniel's the one who tells him what the dream is and interprets it, and he promotes him. Talk about, Nebuchadnezzar is all over the place. And so what does he do? He builds the statue that he dreamt of. And Daniel told him, hey, this is the statue that things are going to fall apart. Well, what's he do? He builds a statue. The same thing. It's made of gold. It's really big, as Jim pointed out, taller than the ceiling, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. It's really big. You can't avoid it. It's amazing. It's great. It's all that type of stuff, right? This is an egotistical king who is over the top, ridiculous, has ego problems, and is surrounded by a bunch of yes men. That's never happened in human history, has it? No, it happens all the time. Happens all the time. This is why the book of Daniel is still relevant to us today, because I can tell you it will happen again somewhere, and multiple times. It's just, that's how humanity has operated for a really long time. Everyone goes along with Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, if you take a look at this, there's not a whole lot of trust going on. Remember the Chaldeans, they were the same wise men who couldn't figure out the king's dreams. And when Daniel did, he got promoted along with, and he asked Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to have a special appointment as well. Well, if you just got embarrassed and there's no trust in the court, you're looking for a way to get back. But the king doesn't trust them either. So this whole thing is full of distrust because they go and they complain to the king, and what's he do? He doesn't trust their word. He doesn't take their word for it. He doesn't trust them. He says, bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm going to give them an opportunity because I don't really trust my advisors. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hey, when all of these musical instruments go off and you bow down and worship, well then, everything is good. And they give a beautiful answer. Because the question that they're answering is really not about falling down and worshiping this, but the question that Nebuchadnezzar poses to them is, who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? That's what this story is about. Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? This king that has supposedly all powerful and is over so many people and can do anything that he wants. Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Because I'm the one with the power. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answer. The beautiful thing about their answer is they don't make a demand on God. If God wants to, God will do this. However, regardless, we're not worshiping your gods. This is the ultimate answer of, no, I'm not going to do this. Forget about the consequences. This is where the theology of martyrdom comes from. I don't want to say the beauty because it's not, I don't have the right words for it, but it's this thing of saying, I'm willing to give it all up and make it eternal, that the answer is no. How do you overcome that? You can't. There have been plenty of people throughout history who have done that very thing. They've paid the price for it, but for all eternity, their no has been permanent. That they were not conquered, that they would not give in, not through violence either. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not violent in this. It's a nonviolent protest. And the reason why the king gets so filled with rage, remember, his face gets distorted. Immediately after that, we talk about the fire gets turned up 7 times its heat. It's like his face. It's so full of rage, and it's so destructive in this, which is who Nebuchadnezzar is, which is who Antiochus Epiphanes was. So upset because not only is this, you disobeyed my rule, but you're not worshiping my gods, and I work through fear. And they said, no, we're not doing it. We're not doing it. Do whatever you need to do. We have faith in God. God may save us or not, but we're in much better hands with God than we are with you. They are honest. They're faithful. They're saying what the thing is. Luther talked about the theology of the cross and the theology of glory. A theologian of glory is saying that good is evil and evil is good. A theologian of the cross calls the thing what it is. And this is what they're doing. The biggest thing about all this is, if you take a look at the whole story of Daniel, is ultimately this way to encourage the people of Israel, who are under oppression, under occupation. Empires are always about destruction and using force and compliance and fear, because it's the only thing they've got. They're one-trick ponies. It's the only thing they've got, because their message is not appealing on its own, especially for those who are not going to benefit from whatever it is that they're offering. So the question is about the people that we deal with and the situations that we deal with. How does this relate? Because it's really easy to get caught up in the idea of an empire and a military empire and all that type of stuff, and that feels really distant. But what are the situations? What are the people that we deal with or have concerns over that are almost over the top, that want compliance, that insist on certain things? What are the concerns that we have about how things are going to happen? I know that there's folks who have expressed concerns about, what happens if certain results in election happen. I don't have any answers to that. I don't know. My answer is we remain faithful. We do what we are called to do. We take example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and our faithfulness of saying no. And we do that together. They did that together. It wasn't one individual. They did that together. There's a lot of things that we struggle with. There are some folks who are figuring out, where am I going to sleep? What am I going to eat? Survival. It's lots of questions that we are forced to deal with that occupy so much of our attention. And we aren't promised anything except that God will not abandon us. Just as God did not abandon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the midst of horribleness. The interesting thing about this, I mentioned this in the Bible study, is the command at the beginning of the story is when all the musical instruments are played, everyone is to fall down and worship. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say no. And the king in his rage says, bind them, the strongest guards are going to take them and they're going to throw this in this overheated furnace. And the furnace is so hot that it kills the guards, but doesn't harm Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it says, the three men fell down, bound into the burning fire. The very same thing that they were supposed to do in front of the statue. And it's there that they encounter not a statue, a fake god, but the real God, or at least a messenger of God. This is where they encounter God. In the most unlikely of places, in a burning fire in which is destructive. And yet it's God who shows up, who does not abandon them in their worst possible time. The time that they think, well, this is it, it's going to happen. It's when God shows up. I'm reminded of, and I'm going to close with this, there's a story of a gentleman, August Landmesser. He was around in the early part of the last century. He was a German, in case you couldn't figure out from his last name. And this is in the early 1930s in Germany. And so he's trying to survive. He ends up becoming a member of the Nazi Party because he's looking for a job. And it's the easiest way to get a job. And he ends up falling in love. And he marries a Jewish woman. And of course, that's a no-no. He gets arrested. He's put on trial. The case is dismissed because they say, well, we didn't know that she was Jewish. So they say, okay, but don't do it again. You're not supposed to be together. Of course, he ignores that because he loves this woman. They have a child together. He ends up leaving the Nazi Party. And in 1936, this is before World War II, he's working in the shipyard in Hamburg. And there's a famous picture. Things had just gotten so out of whack, and August had just completely just said that was wrong. Completely changed. He saw the light. He saw what was literally happening to his family. And he had had enough. And there's a picture in the shipyard. Adolf Hitler comes to the shipyard as they're building all of these vessels and everything, and there's a big rally. And when he comes in, of course, they do that salute. And if you take a look, and you can Google this, all of them are doing the salute except for August Landmesser. They're everyone around him. And he's standing there with his arms crossed, risking it all, saying, no, I have to be here, but I don't have to do that salute. I don't have to put up with this. I can see that what's happening is wrong. He'd end up being arrested, going to a concentration camp. He'd end up being forced into conscription and dying in a battlefield. But he was true. He knew. He knew what was going on. And he said no. I think the message for us, whether we're talking about the emperor's new clothes or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace or August Landmesser, is stuff's going to happen. We have an opportunity to say no. To tell the truth. To say, this isn't right. And hopefully we do that when we're not alone. We stay together. Because we need to. We can't go this alone. We can't determine what will happen. Things are going to happen. But this is why we have community. This is why we have a community of faith. So we don't have to face these things alone. And that God will not abandon us. God never abandons us. God is with us in the midst of the worst possible things. God stays with us. God is faithful to us. Even when our faith may waver, God stays faithful to us. God is always present with us. And sometimes it's in the worst things that God is most present to us. And that's when transformation happens. That's when we see amazing things. That's the good news. Good news isn't always happy, joy, joy, great. Good news is that we are not forgotten. We are not alone. We are never alone. Anything else the world has to offer, it's always temporary. It's always temporary. It blows off. It goes away. But God always stays with us. Thanks be to God. Thank you again for listening to the Sermon Podcast. I'm always happy to have a conversation or pray with you. Please reach out either by email to pastor@christharrisburg.org or call me at 717-236-8382. I'd also invite you to be part of worship on Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. We're a very diverse, open, affirming, and laid-back congregation. Christ Lutheran Church is located at 124 South 13th Street in Harrisburg. Parking is along the street. You can enter the building through the side entrance on South 13th Street or at the corner of 13th and Thompson Streets. And lastly, check us out on the web. Our website is christharrisburg.org. There you can learn more about and offer your support for the congregation as well as the health ministries and free clinics that we provide to people in need in our neighborhood. I invite you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram also at Christ Lutheran Harrisburg. Thank you. I look forward to connecting with you, and I pray that you have a blessed week.